Good afternoon. This is Breaking Ground at BSides Las Vegas. This talk is See You Later, Allocator. Before we get started, some quick announcements. First of all, I'd like to thank our sponsors, especially our diamond sponsors, LastPass and Palo Alto Networks. Our gold sponsors, including Intel, Google, Amazon. Their support is what makes this conference possible, so please say hello to them outside. As always, we are streaming, cell phones off, please. If you have questions, there'll be time for questions at the end of the talk. Just raise your hand. We don't have speaker mics today. And with that, please welcome Daniel Donze.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I just want to make sure, can everyone hear me in the back? Awesome. All right, I just want to do a quick survey. So who decided to show up to this talk because of the pun? Who else decided to show up because volatility was in the name? All right, good show of hands. Who showed up because they really want to dig into some Linux internals today? Wow. All right, let's get this started. So, a little bit about me. I'm a recovering grad student, graduated from Louisiana State University, taking part in the LSU's Applied Cybersecurity Lab. We like to do a lot of hands-on cybersecurity activities, try to bridge the gap between theory that's being taught and actually getting hands-on keyboards. And in a former life, I was a software developer. So, memory forensics. It is a branch part subset of digital forensics. It kind of sits in between traditional disk forensics, where you power off the machine, yank the disk out, go do analysis on it later, and live forensics, where you're looking at stuff coming through the network, analyzing things as they're happening. Memory forensics kind of sits in the middle because you take a copy of the machine's memory as it's running, which gives us a little bit of insight into the state of the machine. And why would we want to do this? Well, it gives us a number of very useful information, such as the processes that are running on the system, any kind of network connections it currently has engaged, the network sockets that it represents, potentially any passwords that are stored in memory or cached in memory, as well as operating system hooks that may involve things like monitoring the keyboard or mouse. Memory forensics also gives us the power to look at who performed what action, since we get to see which processes started which other processes, which means we can attribute activities on machines to either users or potentially malware if we find it on the system. And in more recent times, there's becoming an increase in the number of memory-only malware. Some examples are Dooku and Corelump. Both reside exclusively in memory, and if you try to do traditional disk forensics, you'll never see it because it never gets written to disk. And likewise, if you try to do live forensics, a lot of times there are anti-analysis mechanisms in place to make that not fun. So how do we do memory forensics? One of the very popular tools is Volatility. Since it's open source, it's plugin based, so if you need to expand the functionality of Volatility to suit a particular analysis need, you are able to do that. And Volatility handles, from a development standpoint, a lot of grunt work behind the scenes. It provides virtual to physical address translation, which saves a lot of pain when you're trying to work with a memory sample, which is just simply a copy of memory from a given time of the machine. And it provides an interface to the kernel objects in the system, so you can look at the data stored in the kernel objects, even manipulate it, get a much deeper of an understanding of what's going on in the system at the time. So what exactly does this analysis look like? It involves running plugins, as I mentioned previously. One such example is pslist, which tries to emulate the PS commands on Linux systems, which I don't know how visible this is, but it provides us with information such as name of the processes running, the IDs of the process, any parent IDs that have started that process, when that process started, and any user or group information that's associated with it. Likewise, there's netstat, which tries to emulate the identical name netstat command on Linux, which walks the process list from a given memory sample and enumerates the sockets that each process has, which gives us important network information, including both local and remote ports, as well as the process that owns a particular socket, which makes it easy to attribute network connections to a particular running process. Now, both of these previous plugins use what's known as a list walking method, where you just take the kernel data structure that contains the list of processes, list of network structures, and so on, and you just walk through that list. The advantage of these approaches is that it's relatively straightforward to do. You just find some point in memory, and you know where they all get linked, so you just follow those links until you've enumerated everything. However, a lot of times deleting things in memory is very lazy, in that whenever something gets freed up, such as when a process terminates, a network connection is closed, all a lot of operating systems do is just simply free up that space to be allocated by something else in the future. So this data is still resident in memory, and it's still important for us to look for it. So there's carving approaches, which just hunt for blobs of data that look like something in memory. One example is PSScan for Linux, which provides us with very similar information to a PS list. The only difference is, since we are carving potentially terminated processes, we can see that for some of these we have a user of -1, which would be invalid. However, this is associated with a process that had been terminated on Linux. And this becomes very useful because we don't want to miss out on processes or commands that are run on a system just because we took a memory sample at the wrong time. Now, Linux, being open source, allows us to look at the memory allocation process directly, and we can create a targeted plugin to analyze Linux memory systems. So if anyone's run this beautiful command pslist cache, you're presented with this glorious message. So what's going on here? SLUB is one of Linux's memory allocation processes. It handles the quote-unquote smaller allocations done in Linux, and pslist cache was written for SLUB's predecessor. So why is this important? Well, SLUB's a kind of niche allocation system that is in about 72% of recorded kernels, and it's also a little bit of a newer allocation system, being added as the default memory allocator for Linux around 2008, 2009, which is about a decade ago. So, really quick, it's important, I don't think I need to make too many points, but Linux is used somewhat widely. 25% of software developer workstations, according to Stack Overflow, use Linux. 80% of web servers are run on Linux. Nearly all of these supercomputers are run on Linux, and Linux serves as part of Android's bootloader. So being able to look at a Linux system, specifically any of the data structures allocated by the kernel, is really important. So how does memory allocation in Linux happen? It starts with kmalloc, which, if anyone in here has programmed in C, has likely used a malloc function, where you just ask, hey, can I have a certain number of bytes in memory? And it gives you a pointer to that memory. The kernel has to handle its own memory as well, so it has a kmalloc function where they just slap the word K, or the letter K in front of malloc, and called it a day. How it works internally, though, is there's actually two subsystems that handle memory allocation in Linux. There's a large request handler, which is known as the page or zone allocator, and a small request allocator, which can be a number of allocators depending on the configuration of the kernel, which is where we're talking or looking at now. So the original small request allocator for Linux was slab. Whenever Linux asks for memory, it groups all the objects that are allocated by the kernel based on the object type. So all of the process structures are put together, all the network structures are put together. It organizes it very nicely. It tracks every single lowercase slab directly. So from a memory forensic standpoint, whenever we're looking for a slab, we can just go through the structures for the capital slab and pull out everything and have a very nice and organized list. There is slob, which was originally an alternative to slab for limited memory or memory constrained systems, oftentimes embedded or IoT device systems. And slob internally functions just as a basic heap, essentially. So in Linux kernel 2.6.23, slub replaced slab. And the reason for doing this was a number of internal optimizations. But from a forensic standpoint, the two key points that changed were slub no longer just groups objects based on their type. It creates caches based on the object size. So, like for example, task structures wouldn't necessarily be grouped with other task structures, but rather objects of a similar size to task structures. Slub also only tracks partially allocated slabs, which are just slabs that still have space for more objects to be put on them. So we're not given these clean lists anymore where we can just iterate through all the lists and pull out every slab in memory. So digging in a little further, what exactly does a slab look like? It's just a pre-allocated chunk of memory that's contiguous, and it aligns objects on a size boundary, which is set by the cache that a slab is being allocated from. Very commonly, these slabs are 1, 2, 4, or 8 pages, although it can vary depending on system optimizations. And at the end of a slab is a free list pointer, which just simply points to the next available space that an object can be stuck in. So, a brief high-level overview of the slub internals. As I've been mentioning previously, there are caches, and each of these caches are responsible for allocating objects of both a certain size and a certain allocation type. The most common ones are just any old regular memory allocation and any memory allocation that needs to occur with direct memory access available. All these caches are linked together in memory by a list, so once the first cache is found, the rest of the caches can be enumerated through. And as I mentioned before, in slub internals, there is a partial list of slabs that are not fully allocated. And then if slub debug is enabled, there is also the list of fully allocated slabs. However, this cannot be relied on to always be there. So how do we get objects out of slabs? If we're given a slab, we can start at the beginning of it and just carve every kmem cache size bytes afterwards, and once we step the size number of bytes afterwards, we're at the start of the next object, and we can just simply walk along the slab in these steps and pull out every object. And in the case of slub, where there may be mixed object types, we can validate that these objects are what we're expecting them to be. Now, because slub does not always have all of the lists available, we wanted to go a little bit further, have a little bit more fun, and assume that we didn't have access to any of the cache lists, neither the partial nor full list. So how do we go about extracting objects in this scenario? Well, from other Volatility plugins, we have access to other kernel lists that are maintained by Linux. And since we know that slub handles all of these small allocations done on a system, if we have an object that is small by Linux's standards, that means if we have a pointer to the object, we know where the object resides in memory. From walking these other kernel lists, then by having an object we have somewhere inside of a slab. And from the cache that a slab would be allocated from, we know how far a cache would extend in both directions. So we can just walk both up and down in memory to pull out objects. Now, I'm not sure how well this is visible in the back, but this method will generate a lot of junk since we are going past the bounds of a slab in both directions, but we're at least guaranteed to get every single object out of a slab. So to test this, we set up virtual machines to collect memory samples from, because whenever you suspend or pause or create a snapshot of a virtual machine, you create a copy of the memory of the virtual machine running. So this gives us a memory file to work off of. And then inside of these virtual machines, we ran some just various command line usage and a artifact generating program, which just created some sockets, closed and freed them, which gives us something to look for in memory that we know what it looks like. So some of the goals we wanted to achieve was creating a new plugin, updating an old plugin, slab info, to accommodate subsystems, since slab info has also not been updated to accommodate subsystems, and recover any processor socket information that we can. So this is the first part of the demo, and hopefully all will go well. All right. Oh, I cannot read that at all. I may just have to. Sorry, folks, a little technical difficulties. All right. Can everyone read that? I know the glare is not the best. Not at all. All right. So I may just unfortunately have to resort to using the backup slides on this. Womp womp. Oh, damn it, Windows. You gotta love when Windows decides to just revert back to settings because you didn't hit a button. All right, well, we'll just have to wing it. So, unfortunately, demo didn't work, but this is just a snapshot of what you would have seen live. So, first we just had to test whether or not first we had to update the old slab info plugin to give us valid information for the caches. This is just as simple as reading from the /proc/slabinfo file on a Linux system, which runs this program, prints out all the metadata information for the caches on Linux, and then we can validate that our program's working because the parts in the top match the parts in the bottom. So moving on to a little more interesting stuff. So how does this actually work with carving out objects that we're looking for? So when we run netstat on the system, we pull out a number of sockets and ports ranging from 1080 to about 1084 or 1094. And there's some holes in the middle, which are the sockets that the program has decided to close and free up. And then whenever we go back with our carving approach, we're able to pull out 3 of the sockets that were found, or 3 of the sockets that were created on the system. So likewise, we can use this approach for carving out some of the processes that had ran and stopped, which were just some of the command lines that had been ran previously. Additionally, Volatility by default hides the swapper processes from the PS list command. So this is a little bit of sanity checking in that we're able to find it with carving. So that was a little experiment. Now, how does this actually fare against real-world malware? A little bit of background is BPF Door was a targeted and incredibly evasive malware. Whenever it ran on a Linux system, it wrote itself directly into memory, killed the original process, cleared out all of the related data for the previous process and the newly running process, it used a Berkeley packet filter to sniff traffic, which allowed it to read any traffic approaching the system before it hit the firewall, since these packets are a filter below the firewall. And so any packet that had the magic value in would get passed to this program, which would just check basically whether it was one of three commands, one being a reverse shell, one being a reverse connect or a connect back shell, and then the third was just a heartbeat. The program is still running. So through traditional means, this is very hard to detect on systems. However, normally through memory forensics, we can run the PSList command, which shows us one of the aliases the BPF door malware uses, one being /user/lib/system, which looks suspicious since normally the name is just the name of the program for the process, not the actual path to that process. And traditionally, we can look at the socket filters and find the BPF filters set up by the process. And this would look suspicious because it is a AF packet with a sock type of raw, so it's just reading the raw network data that's coming in, which should trigger some alarms, since usually only system level stuff should be running these packet filters. Now, one of the other samples that we had run was the BPF door, only it had additional rootkit functionality to hide itself from the kernel list. So in the listing shown here, if you are able to read it, you'll see that there's no suspicious processes running. And then likewise, we don't find the packet filter set up by the malware because it's removed itself from Linux's process list. So since the socket filter relies on the Linux process list to pull out any of the socket information, it's also hidden there. However, with a carving approach, we are able to ultimately find the malicious process running on the system, and thus busting it. So overall, recovering free or hidden objects is important. Free objects provide additional context into the system and give a little bit more resiliency to when you take a memory sample. And then likewise, any objects that have been hidden through malicious methods, obviously those raise concerns, and you would want to find those through memory forensics. And then this approach is still useful even if a traditional full cache list extraction is available, since going through that process involves some back-end calculations that will slow it down, as well as this still provides a solution for when slub debug is not enabled, which would hide some of the slabs through traditional means. So just a quick summary. The work we did developed a method for extracting objects from the slub allocator on Linux systems, which allows Volatility to extract hidden data on memory samples. Created a new plugin to use, as well as updating an old plugin to accommodate the new system. And some of the future work for this would be obviously updating the plugin for Volatility 3. Volatility is currently in between version 2 and 3, so a lot of development's done for 2, but will ultimately be updated for 3. Add some additional polish and filter to the plugin so it doesn't produce as much noise in the output. And then finally, Linux is adding a new way of representing memory in newer Linux kernel versions, which will definitely impact memory forensics. Thank you. Is there anyone with questions?
So, since you're mostly looking through subjects as freed objects, one of the things that sometimes what they've done is to scrub memory that you're freeing. But in that case, does that potentially limit your ability to detect some of these rootkits that might run only in memory and then upload themselves after the scan?
All right, so just want to make sure I heard everything right. So the question was, how does this work in situations where a malicious process may try to scrub itself out of memory after it runs to unload? So that would defeat this approach. However, approaches like that still have the possibility of creating other artifacts on the system that would indicate that a process tried to scrub itself out of memory as it was leaving, which would still raise it as suspicious. It may hide certain functionality of that depending on what it's trying to scrub, but it would still ultimately create more artifacts that would point back to it as being suspicious.
So like entropy analysis is the reason for that. Anyway, have you tried taking the object regions that you're going through and basically saying, even if I can't represent this, I can characterize it and verify things? You do anything where you just maybe go? You showed examples of places where you use the types of lists that are walking, process lists.
Right.
Do you think your technique could be extended to try to just find blocks that seem to have similar characteristics and things that are noticeably different from them for their placement?
So,
Artifacts out of place.
right. The question is, could this approach be used to go through memory and categorize different regions as like similar?
Yeah, and then perhaps find something that didn't seem to match because you didn't know.
So, not the approach I directly implemented. This very much targets a specific Linux memory allocator. So this hunts for regions of memory allocated, and you would know based on the cache you're enumerating what types of objects would be there, whether it's a special cache that's been like specifically allocated for a certain object or a set of objects, or just a general cache. So this still like pinpoints like regions of memory to analyze, but it doesn't do entropy analysis itself.
Thanks. And if no one had anything else, would you evaluate how this approach might be used on a system that was operating mostly containers? Where we simply trying to run the same approach as every container, or can you do anything from a higher level?
So the question was, how would this approach fare in environments that use a lot of containers? So I don't have that much background on containers. So are you asking if like you're analyzing the memory of this like system running the containers, or the memory inside of the containers themselves?
Well, I guess both. Would you be able to draw any conclusions about the systems and containers from this high-level approach to only have access to this bulk memory and don't allow RAM to dry out or something like that?
Yeah, so I think that would depend on the specific container you're looking at, just how like that gets set up in memory and which kernel structures it would allocate, because this ultimately is a kernel allocator. So a lot of userland objects, which I'm not being familiar enough with containers, I don't know which parts of the container would fall under, would create kernel objects versus userland objects. So you could definitely use it to analyze the kernel objects it creates, especially if like it creates, when containers are being spun up or create any allocations, if they have like any remarkable features that you can say like this like is a Docker container object, whatever, based on some like specific markings or like a specific set of flags that get set.
But your research can say it's all kind of experimental level.
Right, this is, you're given a memory sample of Linux, how can you better analyze it using the memory allocators present in Linux?
How would you defeat this technique?
Defeating this technique? So probably the most direct way to defeat so the question was, how would you defeat this technique? And the most direct way would be doing your best to scrub. You would have to mangle whatever, like if you have a process you're trying to hide, you would have to mangle it so that it wouldn't appear like a valid process. If you were to apply for a particular memory sample, you would know it's Linux x.x. You know what the task structure looks like. So it has all the fields and set offsets. So you would have to mangle a process struct in a way where it would still run, but if you were to try and fit the data into the mold of a task struct, it wouldn't look valid. But the risk of that is also in the process of mangling anything, you also run the risk of creating more artifacts that points to the mangling, which then raises suspicion about whatever gets mangled. I mean, I'm good if there's no more questions.